This is Jack Stanley, and this is number 6 in our talk on the American presidency. As I said, I'm just kind of babbling on about various aspects of it, just in conversation, one might say. And we ended up in the last with John Tyler, and of course, the president that produced more children than any other president. An interesting thing, he was dropped, of course, by his party, which was the Whig Party, because he just didn't disagree with them. Of course, he was a Democrat. There's a reason that he didn't agree with the Whig Party. But of course, he brought Texas into the Union. And shortly before leaving the White House, and of course not being nominated for re-election, he had a grand gala at the White House. And with a little bit of fun, he said, "You see, I do have a party." And his party would be just that. And once again, every president, every individual who ever became president due to the secession of following the president upon their death or whatever, they owe a debt of gratitude to John Tyler because he had a backbone. Now, John Tyler, of course, after leaving the presidency, he was in charge of the Peace Commission that would try to meet with Abraham Lincoln to avoid a civil war. When Lincoln would not meet with them, he went back. He joined the Confederacy, became part of its governing body, and then he died. He was buried in Hollywood Cemetery. And right by James Monroe. And his grave would not really be marked for many, many years because he was looked upon as a traitor. But he stood by his beliefs. I have to give that to John Tyler. Now, following John Tyler was a fellow we called Young Hickory. That was James K. Polk, a severe, humorless individual who was an ardent slave owner, very religious. He would buy and sell slaves from the White House. I mean, this guy hated anything against slavery. One person he truly hated was John Quincy Adams. He referred to John Quincy Adams as that damn old man, because John Quincy Adams was fighting against slavery. And for a while, James K. Polk was Speaker of the House. And he had to deal with Adams. And Adams just drove him nuts. And Adams loved every minute of it. So, the interesting thing is that James K. Polk would have to deal with John Quincy Adams while he was president. Of course, Adams would die in February of 1848 at the Capitol. I mean, he died at his job. Of course, Polk would serve one term. He said he would only serve one term. And he did. Of course, he believed in something called manifest destiny, which is basically the thought that it is with divine providence that this country should be from coast to coast. And of course he was going to do it come hell or high water, even if it meant invading Mexico. And I have to tell you, the Mexican-American War was not really a war. It was an invasion. It was a conquest for territory. Managed, pushed, directed, and desired by James K. Polk. John Quincy Adams was totally against it. In fact, he was arguing against giving awards and medals to people who had fought in the war when he had his stroke and died. There's something really dreadful about the war. We don't really talk about it. People don't even know about it. but it was a war of conquest. You have to remember that earlier you had the battles in Texas. Remember that stupid thing called the Alamo, where it was a battle for freedom? Well, was it actually a battle for freedom? You have to understand that Mexico had outlawed slavery, and Southerners wanted to come in and expand into Mexico and bring their slaves with them, which Mexico said no. And they also said you had to convert to Roman Catholicism if you want to become a part of Mexico. And so the Battle of the Alamo was many different things, but one of them they called a battle for freedom. But it really wasn't. It was a battle for slave owners trying to bring the people that they enslave and take away their freedom. So I find that whole thing about the Alamo a real big farce. That's pure BS. It's kind of an embarrassing period in our history. And the Mexican-American War is equally an embarrassing and dark blot on our country. His wife, who worked very close with him, Sarah Childress Polk, I think, something like that. They worked side by side. They were very devout. They were very religious. But Mrs. Polk loved to find out what was going on with their Secretary of State, who was James Buchanan, who had a partner, Senator King. They were gay. Okay, this is something that was pretty well known, and Mrs. Polk always wanted to get all the good scuttlebutt. Oh, she was religious, but she loved her gossip. And she used to write letters and say that Mr. Buchanan doesn't look too good. Looks like he had a little trouble with his other half. And so it became quite a big thing going on there. They had fun with James Buchanan. Andrew Jackson referred to him as Miss Nancy. It's interesting. You don't hear about this stuff, but James Buchanan was gay. He would eventually become president, be our first gay president. His partner would become the first gay vice president. We don't know about that either. But the interesting thing is that Mrs. Polk had a lot of time spending talking about James Buchanan. Also, she liked her candles. James K. Polk allowed gas to be put into the White House for lighting. Mrs. Polk said, "One room is going to remain candles for me." And there was a great reception at the White House, and the gas failed. And the White House was plunged into darkness, except for the one room in which Sarah was, with all the candles, and she was a happy. She was known as the Spanish Donna, they called her. So it was an interesting period of time, and James K. Polk did almost everything he said he would. But I'm not saying that what he did was great. It was pretty bad in some respects, but Manifest Destiny was a big part of the White House, a big part of the United States, and a big thing at the time. James K. Polk was gone. He wasn't going to run for re-election. He would die within a few months of leaving office. And his wife, Sarah, would live for many, many years until the 1890s. Talking and basically sharing with anyone the history of her husband. I think she died in 1891, about 42 years after her husband. The next individual who would become president is a very unlikely individual at best. His name was Zachary Taylor. He was a general during the Mexican-American War and became quite famous, as did Winfield Scott. And it was a battle of generals. And of course, in amongst the fray here was the standard batch of candidates that had been running for president for ages. Henry Clay. Daniel Webster put in a few tries, and a few others, but Henry Clay was the big one that kept running and running and running. Eventually, he had said something that became standard comments, that I'd rather be right than president. It was a good way to put it, the fact that he never was president, although he almost made it a couple of times. But he became extremely famous as a great legislator, and of course would be part of that three that would do the great Missouri Compromise the Great Compromise of 1850, which would stave off a civil war for 10 years. And let's talk about that whole thing. Zachary Taylor, who was he? What was he? Well, he was about as unpolitical as you could get. He was not an individual that ever voted. He was nominated for president. They sent him a letter saying that he had been nominated. It was short on postage. He refused to pay the postage. It was sent back. He just was not the individual that you would expect. He was kind of short and dumpy, and but he would become president in 1849. In 1850, an amazing series of events took place that would have a profound effect on the nation, and could have had a far more profound effect had an escape valve had not been found. You see, Zachary Taylor was a slave owner, but he would not tolerate threats of secession or seceding from the Union. He had a serious situation that there were threats to leave the Union, South Carolina. The nation was heating up with an awful lot of issues. You had Stephen Douglas, who was kind of shaking things up a little bit. And everything got extremely ugly. In fact, it looked like the country was going to fall apart. Into the fray came the three old-timers who had been involved in governing for many, many years. And that was John Calhoun, Daniel Webster, and Henry Clay. Collectively, they worked together and came up with what was called the Compromise of 1850, which made the Fugitive Slave Act a little bit more powerful. It gave more rights to slave owners. It made the North a little happier. It did a number of things. It basically was a Band-Aid. Now, Zachary Taylor, the President of the United States, took a look at it and said, I don't want it. I won't sign it. If they want to have a battle, let them. In fact, Zachary Taylor was about ready to take control of the army and invade the South and solve the whole situation. Things got really ugly. In July of 1850, they had a celebration at the stump of the Washington Monument.